What's going on, everybody? It's Charles. In this video, we are going to be upgrading the clutch, pressure plate, and flywheel on the Turbo R32. I'm going to be installing the spec Stage 3 Plus clutch, which should be good to hold around 600 pound-feet of torque. This moves us from a dual mass flywheel like the car had originally to a single mass flywheel on our upgraded setup. And we're saving about 6 pounds by going with this clutch. Okay, something else to consider before you get started and do what I did and get your clutch all the way bolted up. Make sure that you don't have any kind of shield that goes between the transmission and the engine block. This VR6 has a shield that goes right here, and I thought that I completely messed this up by forgetting to put this shield in. However, luckily this one is a two-piece. But if you have one of the single pieces, you need to get that on before you put anything on. Otherwise, you are going to be pulling that clutch back off, or you're gonna have to cut it, bend it, and put it around. I've been burned by this before, forgetting this. Make sure you don't forget your shield if your car has one. So working back here at the backside of our engine, first thing we wanna do is we wanna clean up our mating surface on our crankshaft. We'll get some acetone and we'll just make sure there's no oil or grease. We'll also go ahead and clean up the back of our flywheel. Something else to point out on the flywheel is that in order to orient the flywheel properly, one of these bolts is actually offset on the crankshaft. So it'll be a little bit closer to where the input shaft goes in. Also, quick tip, if you're doing a job like this and the car you're working on has a pilot bearing, which is a bearing inside right here, probably a good idea to replace it. This particular one does not have a pilot bearing here. So we do have one bolt hole right here that's offset. We need to make sure we line up our flywheel accordingly, and it looks like this right here is probably going to be our orientation. I was wrong. This looks like it's our orientation. Right here, this bolt hole is a little bit closer to the center opening than the ones next to it, which corresponds to right here. So if we put this on, all of our bolt holes should line up perfectly. With our flywheel properly lined up, we'll go ahead and start all of our bolts. Now, the reason I'm doing the clutch and everything now is that the holes in the crankshaft where these bolts thread into actually go all the way through the crankshaft. If we were to put oil in the engine now, the oil would just seep out of these holes and then we would make a big giant mess. So the next step, we can move on to doing our turbo test fitment, getting our oil pan drilled out for our oil return line, make sure that everything fits properly. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna just snug these bolts down in stages, so a little bit at a time. We're also going across the center portion of the flywheel to make sure that when we start to get actually tight with the flywheel, we're nice and even. Last thing you want would be the flywheel cockeyed and not sitting perfectly flush. You'll find that there's really two key things that we want to focus on when doing a clutch, pressure plate, and flywheel. We want to make sure that we're tightening everything down nice and evenly in stages. That way nothing is tweaked one way or the other. We also want to make sure that we're actually torquing all of this stuff down. And we want to make sure we're working clean. Before we put our friction disc on, we're going to clean this really, really well and make sure that there's no oil or grease. Even though my hands are mostly clean, we need to make sure that these surfaces where our friction disc touches are clean. No oil, no grease, no dirt, no grime. Next up, we're going to do our initial torque on our flywheel. So this flywheel's torqued down in 3 stages, 30 Newton meters, 60 Newton meters, and then another 90 degrees. I also have the crankshaft holder on the front side of the crankshaft to make sure that we're not moving our flywheel or crankshaft around. You can also get one of the flywheel holders that hold it back here on the flywheel. That works really well too. So we're gonna start going across the center of our flywheel, torquing to 30 Newton meters. After I do that first 30 Newton meters, I usually like to go around one more time, just make sure that I got everybody. This is easy to do when you have a specific torque value you're chasing, 30 Newton meters, 60 Newton meters. A little harder to do when you're adding that half turn or quarter turn. Next up, do the same thing to 60 Newton meters. There is something just insanely satisfying about the click of a torque wrench. Now for our quarter turn, this gets a little bit easier because it's a quarter turn or 90 degrees. We'll do our standard marking of our bolt at 12 o'clock because unlike with the torque value, that specific torque value, we can't go back and double check to see rotated it a quarter turn. So we'll mark it 12 o'clock and we'll just tighten it until our mark points to 3 o'clock. We're gonna also upgrade to a little bit bigger of a ratchet on this one. Also not a bad idea to use a breaker bar to get this quarter turn, but this shouldn't be too bad. I also, in addition to having the mark, I'll stage the ratchet or the breaker bar or whatever I'm using at a place where I can easily strike a quarter turn and get it tight. And just keep going all the way around. Now at a quick glance, we can make sure that we have all of these bolts properly tightened. Next up is a part that is, let's be honest, not super glamorous, not super exciting, but hopefully a little satisfying, and that's cleaning our flywheel. Even though this is a brand new flywheel, a little towel with some acetone on it, look at how much dirt I ended up pulling off just that little bit. So we want to make sure that there is nothing on this surface of the flywheel here. That's just after a couple of times around. These little touches like this can be the difference between a clutch that functions awesome and has a really long life versus blowing a clutch out very early on because there's a spot of grease that causes a hot spot and then ruins the friction disc. This is a spot too that might be worth putting on a clean pair of gloves just to make sure you don't get any yuck on here. Now, we're not making microchips, right? So it doesn't have to be a clean room environment, but the better job we do, well, the better job we'll do. So I basically just clean these until no more dirt comes off the towel. Next up, we have to install our friction disc of our clutch. Now, this kit came with a clutch alignment tool that lines up the splines of the friction disc. And then what happens is you take this tool, you stick it in, and it centers your clutch. Make sure that you'll be able to get your transmission installed. This little spot here is meant to go into a crankshaft with a pilot bearing, and our crankshaft doesn't have a pilot bearing. So that's what happens when you try and use this clutch alignment tool that came with the clutch. What should be is the end should be wide enough to where it goes into the crankshaft and sits just like that. Now this is from another VR6, but unfortunately these splines don't spline in. As you can see, the splines are a bit different. So we can't use this one. We can't use this one. Unfortunately, cutting this little nub off, all that does is just let that sit right there, still won't work. So what I had to do is go to the dealership and borrow the proper OE factory clutch alignment tool, which is frustrating because, well, I had to make a trip all the way there, and this tool right here, nice metal, perfectly fitting piece, is only $15. So we'll get our friction disc, make sure flywheel side faces the flywheel. We'll take our alignment tool, the one that actually fits this time, slide it in the clutch, put the tool into the crankshaft, and then just slide that right on. So that'll perfectly center our friction disc onto our flywheel. Now that we have our friction disc installed, it is time for this beautiful pressure plate, which I got to tell you, I'm a little sad that it doesn't match our purple, but you'll never see it once the transmission's bolted up, so who cares? We need to do the same thing that we did to the flywheel to our pressure plate, and that's make sure the surface where it's going to touch our friction disc is really, really clean. But look at how dirty that is. That's just one swipe around. So it's really dirty. This one you may end up having to spend more time cleaning than you did the actual flywheel. Last chance to make sure your clutch is installed in the proper orientation. We are good right here. At the beginning, we had a yellow mark on our flywheel that lined up with a yellow mark on our friction plate, this yellow mark right over here. So our yellow mark is down here, which means this pin, this alignment dowel here, goes here. So we gotta rotate this guy this way, and we're just gonna slide this on. Now I have found that sometimes this takes a little bit of coercion to get into place. There we go. All right, so we're lined up. Now these are the bolts that hold our pressure plate to our flywheel, and then in turn hold the clutch into place. The factory ones do have a bit of Loctite on them, so I'm gonna go ahead and put some Loctite on as well. Also, I prefer the gel Loctite. Let me know in the comments what you prefer, gel thread locker or that liquidy gooey kind. We'll go ahead and start each one of these bolts. The same strategy that we had for the flywheel applies to the pressure plate. We wanna make sure we're snugging this down evenly in stages, going across the middle of, well, in this case, like our alignment tool. That way we make sure we apply even pressure on our pressure plate. The more I think about that clutch alignment tool, the saltier I get on it. Okay, we got everybody started. Now I'm just gonna kind of snug these down by hand. You can really see here how the diaphragm spring is pulling in. This is a good example of why we need to walk in our pressure plate. Otherwise, you run the risk of one of these spring pieces getting tweaked. Then we're going to go ahead and torque all of our bolts down to 22 newton meters, crossing the center of our assembly, and of course, marking each bolt after we torque it. All right, so really not that big of a deal to install at least a base clutch like this. When you start getting multiple discs and things like that, it can get pretty complicated, but keep these couple of things in mind. One, make sure you're following the repair manual and torquing everything down. Not only just torquing it down, but working in those stages so that everything gets installed and pushed in evenly. Two, make sure you're working clean. Clean is pretty vital to the life of your clutch. And also, you want to follow the clutch manufacturer's recommendations for any kind of break-in procedures that it might have. I think this one had about a 500 mile where they don't want you going full throttle all in. I'm not going to lie. That's going to be really, really hard with such an awesome engine. And hopefully this clutch will hold that roughly expected 500 wheel horsepower that we are targeting. All right, so I'm gonna wrap it up there. I'll put links to the clutch kit and everything that we used today, including some of those really rad gear wrench tools. I'll even link the proper clutch alignment tool, not that one, so that you can actually install your clutch and not have that floppity thing. With that, I'm out. Thank you guys so much for watching. More VR6 content coming soon, because now we get to actually install the turbocharger. Anyway, have an awesome day, and I'll talk to you again next time. Bye-bye.